This is a project I've been working on for a couple of years. I lived in Ontario for a long time before I came back to Saskatchewan. And I saw how at one time Toronto was a very socially engaged city with a lot of government involvement in social housing and public financing of entertainment and health facilities. And so, for example, there's a place called Ontario Place. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it was a publicly funded entertainment complex that, like, so for $7 you could go see a band and ride the rides and just sort of enjoy the summer air and water with your friends. And I always thought that was one of the reasons that Toronto enjoyed a remarkably low crime rate. Because it was like, whoa, should we go knock off the drugstore? No, there's a great band at Ontario Place. Let's do that later. And it created engagement in the community. There was also the Sky Dome, which was this several $100 million public expenditure that was then sold to Rogers for, I think, 1/5 the cost. And they made great money on that. And then Ontario Place was also sold, and it became sort of private and much more expensive. And I started to see this privatization of public spaces occurring in Ontario, and I wondered what was happening. And then I noticed that also in Saskatchewan, with its rich heritage of public ownership, and people like Tommy Douglas advocating that we actually own our resources, that something strange had happened. Because how could a province so wealthy be so poor that they can't afford things like a bus service or adequate dental care and housing? We're actually one of the richest, poorest places in the whole world, one of the top 10 GDP per capita for some time now. So this guy, Jack Mintz. I mean, he's sort of an unlikely hero, but without him, we'd have very little indication as to what has happened. So he wrote a report, back in 2008 or 9, he was already warning the Wall government that something terrible was happening here. That although we had an incredible, rich resource in terms of potash, that quite often could generate $7 billion in revenue, we were collecting virtually nothing. So, and the reason for that is we actually collected money, but then we gave it all back in forms of a credit later on. The history of that is a bit complicated, but I'll advance to the next slide. I think one of the reasons we don't really engage in economics and we find the terms abstract would be like, what used to happen is the hordes would come in and steal your wealth, and it was very clear that something was happening. There was mayhem and madness. So now we have this kind of takeover. We have elites who rise to power based on their capacity to manipulate media perception, and they have access to vast sources of revenue and power that never existed in the time of Genghis Khan. And this affects our children. I think potash is a wonderful industry, and it's great that Saskatchewan developed it, and it's provided a lot of jobs and some great resources. But what is the purpose of having resources if we can't provide things for our children? And we're talking about very, very large sums of money. So this is a list of countries by GDP. So actually Saskatchewan kind of compares favorably in terms of GDP per capita in what's called purchase parity dollars, that can kind of even things out. We're sort of in between Luxembourg and Saudi Arabia. We're actually a very, very wealthy place when you do GDP per capita. So $1 billion is like $1,000 per person, and we're up in around $50,000 per person. We're an incredibly wealthy province, but we've been led to believe that we have to implement a kind of austerity because we must forego our revenue to large corporations who control our jobs and our futures. So this is what corporate rating of a province looks like. So you'll notice that this top line is, so there's a little purple line. So the two squiggly ones at the top, but the second squiggly one represents the value of sales in billions of dollars. So in 2008, things really started to pick up. $6 billion in revenue. And the province collected almost $1 billion when you calculate royalty and taxes. But then the next year there was a drop in production. And then things started to go haywire. We actually ran into a position where we were actually refunding taxes under a very complicated, such a complicated scheme. That's what this Minsk guy points out. This thing is so complicated that nobody really understood it, including politicians. It seemed like different deals had been crafted over time, but the biggest problem that Minsk pointed out was that for every $100 million the industry spent on expansion, they could collect $120 million in future credits. And he warned the Wall government that this was going to cause serious problems in the future, because we would actually quite possibly reach the absurd situation where we would be collecting negative revenue on record profits. And he used the word absurd. He said we were one of the worst in the world in terms of our capacity to make meaningful use of incredible wealth. I don't know if you remember when BHP wanted to take over Potash Corp, a few years ago now, and the government refused to accept BHP's offer because they thought it wouldn't be good for Canada or the province. But it turns out because of the credit, because BHP could have bought that credit, they could start applying that credit against their expenses immediately. It would have cost the province about $2 billion, according to Minsk. So the real reason they refused the deal because BHP would have gained control of billions of dollars in credits that they could apply to their huge mine at Jansen. So, next slide. And this is from the report by Jack Mintz. So basically he was saying that in a period of a few years, we actually gave the industry $6 billion in credits to apply against income, resulting in a revenue that was less than 1% on record profits. So what does that mean? That's like free education, free post-secondary education for everyone in the province for 4 years. That's $1 billion. $1 billion is a train from here to Regina, free for a year. It's housing, it's opportunities for children and youth. It's helping to address climate change. It's a lot of money for such a small province to have, and to simply not be courageous enough to stand up to these industries and say, this is ours, and it belongs to our children. And it has a history that is deeper than a mine. It's about people and land. So this is a term that's used in this report called marginal effective and tax royalty rate. And basically what it means is what's sort of the total when all's said and done. So in the words of the report, Saskatchewan's potash regime is highly complex and inefficient compared to its international peers. And this is a polite way of saying we're crazy. We're not collecting money on exceptional wealth. Simply abolishing at the bottom all of the credits and things, and basically they're kind of like sophisticated, well, they're not kickbacks, but they kind of operate that way. You spend money, you spend $1 million and we'll give it all back plus a little bit. It's perfectly legal. But if we didn't have these paybacks, these credits, we would have an effective rate of about 20%. So 20% of $5 billion in revenue would be $1 billion, easy. But the weird thing is, because of all the credits, we ended up collecting, at 1 year, it was 0.3%. So not even a percentage point, not 1% of billions of dollars in revenue. Is it confusing? Yes. It's like, when I first started going through this, I was like, is any of this actually real? And if it wasn't for mints, like this guy is a world-recognized policy economist for resources. He's worked with governments all over the world, and he calls us one of the worst that he's ever worked with, because it's so incredibly confusing that the average person can't understand it, that government seems to not even understand it. And it gets really weird because we have one of the highest rates at 14% and one of the lowest at negative 34%. So those are some pretty weird ranges, and it's all in how you apply the credit. So a negative credit means we're actually paying the industry for the privilege of making money. And at one time we actually owned this industry. So it's quite a remarkable turn of events. So there was an article, and I thought that was really telling, that CKOM, one of the best articles I saw on this. That article is no longer on the CKOM site. However, if you go to the next slide, I did actually manage to capture it. And I mean, it's available in different, sort of archival sites. But even CKOM, which is a conservative, pro-Sask party kind of media empire, even they brought up the fact that, we're losing out on billions of dollars. Like $1 billion is $1,000 million. So Brad Wall even acknowledged this at the end of the article. He says, we're welcoming $12 billion worth of expansion. So that would seem to imply that we're on the hook for that $12 billion plus 20%. Now we won't be on the hook for the whole amount, but a large portion of that we're going to be paying for the Jansen mine in the future, because although they couldn't collect the credit immediately, that was one of the last mining projects to capture the 120% credit. But I think the government, whatever happens next, is we need to view this significant investment by the people of Saskatchewan as something that we need to recover. So a surcharge of, say, 10% over the next 10 years to sort of recoup the investment would be wise. But I think it's important for us to know what happened